In 1945, Europe was a graveyard, 50 million dead, cities flattened, factories bombed into rubble, railways destroyed, bridges collapsed. The continent that had dominated the world for 5 centuries was starving, freezing, and broken. Then America did something unprecedented. They wrote a check for $13 billion. They shipped food to their former enemies. They rebuilt factories they had just finished bombing. They poured money into countries that had tried to kill American soldiers 2 years earlier. The Marshall Plan, the most generous act in human history, or was it? Because here's what they don't teach you in school. By 1952, America didn't just save Europe. America owned Europe. Every government that took Marshall money became dependent on Washington. Every economy that accepted American aid became locked into an American system. Every country that cashed those checks gave up a piece of its sovereignty. $13 billion bought the United States something no war could conquer. An entire continent. This is the story of how America turned charity into empire, how generosity became control, and how the greatest act of kindness in history was also the smartest investment ever made. To understand what America did, you first have to understand what Europe looked like in 1945. Germany was destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. Allied bombing had flattened every major city. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin, charred ruins stretching for miles. Millions were homeless. Millions more were living in basements, in ruins, in holes in the ground. The infrastructure was gone. Railways that had moved troops and supplies for 6 years were twisted wreckage. Bridges across the Rhine were rubble. The canals were clogged with debris. Roads were cratered. Ports were blocked with sunken ships. And it wasn't just Germany. France had been occupied for 4 years and fought over for 1. Normandy was devastated. Northern France was scarred with battlefields, cratered towns, and destroyed farms. Factories had been stripped by the Germans or bombed by the Allies. The Netherlands had been starved. In the winter of 1944-45, the Germans cut off food supplies. The country was exhausted, depleted, traumatized. Poland had lost 6 million people, nearly 20% of its population. Warsaw was rubble. The country barely existed as a functioning state. Italy was fractured and poor. Greece was sliding into civil war. Austria was occupied. Hungary was under Soviet control. Across the continent, governments were broke. Currency was collapsing. Black markets were thriving. People traded cigarettes for bread and coal for medicine. This was Europe in 1945. The continent that had colonized the world, that had invented the Industrial Revolution, that had built empires spanning the globe, was now starving, freezing, and powerless. The winter of 1946-47 was the worst in a century. Temperatures plunged across Europe. Rivers froze. Coal couldn't be transported because the railways were still broken. Factories shut down. People burned furniture to stay warm. In Germany, the official ration was 500 calories per day. That's starvation level, slow death by malnutrition. And many Germans got even less. In Britain, rations were actually lower than during the war. Bread was rationed for the first time ever, something that hadn't happened even under Nazi bombing. In France, coal production was at 40% of pre-war levels. Industrial output was collapsing. Inflation was eating savings. People were losing faith in democracy. Across the continent, people were cold, hungry, and desperate. And desperate people do desperate things. Communist parties were surging. In France, the Communist Party won 28% of the vote in 1946, the largest communist party in Western Europe. In Italy, communists and socialists together won nearly 40%. In Greece, communists were fighting a civil war. In Germany, communist agitation was spreading. American officials watched with growing alarm. They had just finished fighting one war against totalitarianism. Now they saw another spreading across the continent. If Europe fell to communism, whether through revolution or election, the Soviet Union would dominate the entire landmass from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Or when America would face a world where half of humanity lived behind an iron curtain. Something had to be done, and only America had the resources to do it. On June 5th, 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall stood before the graduating class at Harvard University. Marshall was a soldier, not a politician. He had been the architect of American victory in World War II, the general who coordinated D-Day, who managed Allied logistics, who commanded the war from Washington. Marshall's speech was vague on purpose. The details would be negotiated, but the basic offer was clear. America would provide massive financial aid to any European country willing to participate in a joint recovery program. The key word was any. Marshall explicitly included the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the invitation. This was strategic genius. If the Soviets accepted, they would have to open their economy to American inspection and influence. If they refused, they would look like the bad guys rejecting help for suffering people. Stalin took the bait. He refused. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov walked out of the initial planning conference in Paris. If they refused, they would look like the bad guys rejecting help for suffering people. He accused the Americans of using economic aid as a tool of imperialism, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. Stalin then pressured the Eastern European countries under Soviet influence to reject Marshall aid as well. Czechoslovakia, which had initially expressed interest, was forced to withdraw. Poland and Hungary were forbidden from participating. The Iron Curtain hardened. Europe was now clearly divided into two camps, those who accepted American help and those under Soviet control. This was exactly what American planners wanted. The Marshall Plan was never really about saving all of Europe. It was about saving Western Europe and binding it to the United States. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States transferred approximately $13 billion to Western European countries. $13 billion. In 1948, money. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $150 billion today. As a percentage of American GDP, it would be equivalent to about $800 billion in modern terms. This was unprecedented. No nation had ever voluntarily transferred this much wealth to other countries. No victor had ever rebuilt its defeated enemies on this scale. The money flowed everywhere. Britain received the most, over $3 billion. France got nearly as much. West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, every participating country received substantial aid. But here's what made the Marshall Plan different from simple charity. The money came with conditions. Every dollar of Marshall aid came with strings attached. First, the money couldn't just be spent however governments wanted. It had to be used for specific purposes: rebuilding infrastructure, modernizing factories, increasing agricultural production. American advisors would help determine priorities. Second, recipient countries had to match American aid with their own contributions. For every dollar America provided, European governments had to put up counterpart funds in their own currencies. This forced fiscal discipline and ensured local buy-in. Third, and most importantly, recipient countries had to coordinate with each other. They couldn't just take American money and go their separate ways. They had to plan together, reduce trade barriers between themselves, and move toward economic integration. This last condition was the real genius of the Marshall Plan. For centuries, European countries had competed with each other, economically, militarily, politically. That competition had produced 2 world wars in 30 years. American planners believed that economic integration would make future wars impossible. If French and German factories depended on each other, if Dutch and Belgian farmers sold to each other's markets, if all of Western Europe was bound together in a web of trade, how could they go to war? The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe, it redesigned Europe, along American lines according to American principles, serving American interests. To administer the Marshall Plan, European countries created the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the OEEC. This was the first step toward what would eventually become the European Union. The OEEC forced European governments to sit down together, share economic data, coordinate policies, and reduce trade barriers. It created habits of cooperation that had never existed before. American officials were intimately involved. The Economic Cooperation Administration, the American agency overseeing Marshall aid, had missions in every participating country. American advisors sat in on planning meetings. American priorities shaped European decisions. This wasn't colonialism in the traditional sense. America wasn't extracting resources or imposing governors, but it was influence on a massive scale. Every major economic decision in Western Europe was made with American input, American approval, American interests in mind. The Europeans accepted this because they had no choice. They needed the money, they needed the food, they needed the fuel. And only America had those things to give. Marshall Plan aid came primarily in the form of American goods. European countries didn't receive suitcases full of cash. They received American wheat, American coal, American machinery, American cotton, American trucks. And the dollars went to American farmers and American manufacturers, and the goods went to Europe. This was not accidental. American industry had expanded enormously during the war. Factories that had produced tanks now needed new customers. Farms that had fed armies now needed new markets. If Europe couldn't buy American goods, American producers would suffer. The Marshall Plan solved this problem elegantly. American taxpayers funded the purchase of American products, which were shipped to European consumers. American business got sales. European workers got jobs, rebuilding with American equipment. Everyone benefited. Well, almost everyone. The system locked European economies into dependence on American products, American technology, American methods. European industries that might have developed differently, perhaps more efficiently, perhaps more suited to local conditions, were instead rebuilt as extensions of the American economic model. This wasn't sinister. American methods were genuinely advanced. American technology was genuinely superior. American management practices were genuinely more efficient. But the result was that European economies became Americanized. They adopted American production techniques, American business practices, American consumer culture. They became junior partners in an American-led economic system. The Marshall Plan worked. That's beyond dispute. By 1952, industrial production in Western Europe was 35% higher than before the war. Agricultural output had recovered. Trade was flowing. The desperate hunger of 1947 was a memory. West Germany experienced what Germans called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. A country that had been flattened, occupied, and divided became an industrial powerhouse within a decade. France modernized its economy, moving from an agricultural society to an industrial one. The chronic instability of the pre-war years gave way to sustained growth. Italy transformed from a poor agricultural country into a manufacturing center. The Made in Italy brand began its rise. Even Britain, despite its ongoing struggles, stabilized and began rebuilding. The communist threat receded. As people got jobs and food and hope, the appeal of revolution faded. Communist parties remained significant in France and Italy, but they never took power. Western Europe stayed in the Western camp. America had saved Europe from starvation, from communism, from itself. But America had also bought Europe, its markets, its alignment, its future. The Marshall Plan rebuilt a continent. It prevented communist takeover. It created the foundations for European prosperity that continue today. But it also bound Europe to America in ways that persist 75 years later. American troops still garrison Europe. American companies still dominate European markets. American foreign policy still shapes European decisions. The Marshall Plan was never just about economics. From the very beginning, American planners understood that money and military power went together. You couldn't have one without the other. Economic aid would stabilize Western Europe, but only military force could protect it. In 1949, 1 year after Marshall Plan aid began flowing, the United States created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For the first time in its history, America committed to permanent military alliances in peacetime. For the first time, American troops would be stationed in Europe, not to fight a war, but to prevent one. This was revolutionary. America had always avoided entangling alliances. George Washington had warned against them. For 150 years, America had stayed out of European conflicts until absolutely forced to intervene. Now America was promising to defend Western Europe forever. The price of salvation was sovereignty, and Europe paid it willingly. Why did Europe need American military protection? The Soviet Union. Stalin had emerged from World War II, controlling everything east of Germany. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, all were now Soviet satellite states governed by communist parties loyal to Moscow. The Red Army was the largest military force in the world. Millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks, battle-hardened veterans who had destroyed the Wehrmacht. They sat in the heart of Europe, a few hundred miles from Paris. Western Europe had almost no defense. The British were broke. The French army was demoralized and rebuilding. West Germany wasn't allowed to have an army at all. Italy was weak. The smaller countries were helpless. If Stalin ordered his tanks west, they could reach the English Channel in weeks. There was nothing to stop them except American power. American officials saw this clearly. The Marshall Plan could rebuild European economies, but it couldn't protect them. Economic recovery would be meaningless if Soviet tanks rolled in and installed communist governments. So alongside economic integration came military integration. Alongside American money came American soldiers. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed on April 4th, 1949 in Washington, D.C. 12 nations joined: the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, Portugal, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. The heart of the treaty was Article 5. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. If the Soviet Union invaded France, America would respond as if the Soviet Union had invaded America itself. This was the nuclear guarantee. America had atomic bombs. The Soviet Union had just tested its first one. By promising to defend Europe, America was essentially threatening nuclear war if Stalin moved west. For Europeans, this was the ultimate security blanket. They didn't need to build massive armies. They didn't need their own nuclear weapons. America would protect them. For America, this was the ultimate influence. Every country under the American nuclear umbrella was also under American leadership. You couldn't accept American protection and then ignore American wishes. NATO wasn't just a military alliance. It was a system of control. Benevolent control, perhaps, but control nonetheless. American protection wasn't theoretical, it was physical. American troops began flowing into Europe almost immediately. By 1953, there were over 400,000 American military personnel stationed in Europe. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, a massive permanent presence. The bases multiplied. Germany alone hosted dozens of American installations. Britain became an unsinkable aircraft carrier for American bombers. Italy, Spain, Turkey, everywhere America established footholds. These weren't temporary deployments. These were permanent garrisons. American families lived on these bases. American children went to American schools. American commissaries sold American products. Little Americas scattered across the continent. 75 years later, American troops are still there. Over 100,000 American military personnel remain stationed in Europe today. The temporary presence became permanent. The protectors became fixtures. European governments accepted this because the alternative was Soviet domination. But they also accepted a fundamental limitation on their sovereignty. You cannot host foreign troops on your soil and claim to be fully independent. The troops are a reminder, however friendly, of who is really in charge. The most dramatic example of American influence was West Germany. In 1945, Germany was occupied, divided, and disarmed. The country that had twice tried to conquer Europe was now under the boots of the victors. The Marshall Plan rebuilt the West German economy. American money poured in, factories were reconstructed, infrastructure was repaired. Within a decade, West Germany was an economic powerhouse again. But who would control this revived German power? The answer was America would. West Germany was integrated into the Western system so thoroughly that independent action became almost impossible. American troops were stationed throughout the country. American nuclear weapons were stored on German soil. American commanders would control those weapons in wartime. West Germany was allowed to rearm in 1955, but only within NATO, under NATO command, with NATO oversight. German soldiers would never again march under purely German orders. They were embedded in an alliance structure that ensured they could never threaten their neighbors. This was the grand bargain. Germany got sovereignty and prosperity. America got control and a bulwark against the Soviets. France and Britain got assurance that Germany would never attack them again. Everyone won something, but America won the most. While NATO handled military integration, the economic system was being locked in through finance. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, had made the US dollar the center of global finance. Every currency was pegged to the dollar. The dollar alone was convertible to gold. International trade was conducted in dollars. Marshall Plan aid reinforced this system. European countries received dollars, spent dollars, accumulated dollar reserves. Their central banks held dollars. Their businesses priced goods in dollars. Their governments borrowed in dollars. By the time the Marshall Plan ended in 1952, the dollar was indispensable. European economies couldn't function without it. American financial power had become as important as American military power. This gave the United States enormous leverage. If a European country did something America didn't like, there were countless ways to apply pressure. Delay loans, restrict trade, manipulate exchange rates. The tools were subtle but powerful. We saw this leverage used brutally during the Suez Crisis. When Britain and France defied America in 1956, the United States threatened their currencies. Within days, they surrendered. The lesson was clear. American allies were free to disagree with Washington, but only up to a point. Cross certain lines and economic weapons would be deployed. American influence wasn't just military and economic, it was cultural. Marshall Plan aid came with American advisors, American methods, and American ideas. Europeans learned American management techniques. They adopted American production systems. They absorbed American ways of thinking about business, efficiency, and growth. American products flooded European markets. Coca-Cola, Hollywood movies, American music, American fashion. The cultural invasion accompanied the economic one. Europeans didn't just use American money. They increasingly lived American lifestyles. This wasn't forced. Most Europeans embraced American culture enthusiastically. After the horror of war, American optimism was appealing. American prosperity was attractive. American movies and music were genuinely entertaining. But the result was a homogenization of Western culture along American lines. European distinctiveness didn't disappear, but it was overlaid with American influences that persist to this day. Walk down any European street, you'll see McDonald's and Starbucks. You'll hear American pop music. You'll see people wearing American brands, watching American shows, following American trends. This cultural influence is so pervasive that most people don't even notice it. It's just how things are. But how things are is the result of deliberate choices made in 1948. Not everyone celebrated the Marshall Plan at the time. The Soviet Union called it dollar imperialism, an attempt to enslave Europe to American capitalism. This was propaganda, but it wasn't entirely wrong. America was using money to expand its influence. That's what empires do. Some Europeans worried about dependence. French President Charles de Gaulle, who came to power later, would complain bitterly about American domination. He pulled France out of NATO's military command. He built French nuclear weapons. He tried to chart an independent course. But de Gaulle was the exception. Most European leaders accepted American leadership gratefully. They had seen what happened without it. 2 world wars, tens of millions dead, their continent destroyed. American hegemony was better than European chaos. American critics existed too. Some conservatives opposed spending taxpayer money on foreign countries. Some progressives worried about militarization and imperialism. The debate over foreign aid continues to this day. But the Marshall Plan passed Congress, NATO was ratified, and America assumed leadership of the Western world. The critics lost. What did America actually buy for $13 billion? First, they bought security. Western Europe didn't fall to communism. The Soviet threat was contained. Eventually, decades later, the Soviet Union collapsed without ever conquering Western Europe. Second, they bought markets. American companies gained access to hundreds of millions of consumers. American products, American services, American investments flowed into Europe and generated returns for decades. Third, they bought allies. NATO countries have fought alongside America in Korea, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. They've supported American positions in international organizations. They've provided bases, intelligence, and diplomatic backing. Fourth, they bought a system. The American-led international order, free trade, dollar dominance, collective security, emerged from the Marshall Plan and NATO. That system persists today, generating benefits for the United States that dwarf the original investment. $13 billion created a world order that has lasted 75 years. That's not charity. That's the best investment in history. Let's put this in perspective. After World War I, the victors imposed harsh reparations on Germany. The Treaty of Versailles demanded payments that crippled the German economy. The result was hyperinflation, political chaos, the rise of Hitler, and another world war. After World War II, America did the opposite. Instead of extracting wealth from the defeated, they poured wealth in. Instead of punishment, rehabilitation. Instead of vengeance, partnership. The contrast in outcomes is stark. Post-WWI Europe got fascism and another war. Post-WOTUSCI, Europe got democracy and 75 years of peace. American generosity deserves credit for this. The decision to rebuild rather than punish was genuinely noble. It reflected lessons learned from the catastrophe of Versailles. But let's not be naive. American generosity served American interests. A prosperous Europe bought American goods. A democratic Europe supported American policies. A peaceful Europe didn't require American soldiers to die in yet another war. The Marshall Plan was both generous and self-interested, both noble and calculating, both rescue and purchase. This doesn't diminish it, it just explains it. The Marshall Plan became a model for American foreign policy. Whenever America wanted to influence a region, it led with economic aid. Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East. American money flowed everywhere, always with conditions attached, always building American influence. The results varied. Not every intervention worked as well as the Marshall Plan. Europe had advantages, educated populations, industrial traditions, democratic experience that other regions lacked. But the template remained. Use money to build allies, use allies to project power. Use power to protect money. A self-reinforcing cycle of influence. Critics call it imperialism. Supporters call it leadership. Both are right. America saved Europe with money and protected it with soldiers. In return, Europe became the foundation of American global power. But what does this relationship look like today? Has Europe broken free, or does American influence persist? And what happens when European and American interests diverge? In Part 3, we'll trace the long arc of American-European relations from 1952 to today, and ask whether the purchase was permanent or temporary. It's been 75 years since the Marshall Plan began. Europe has changed enormously. The rubble is long gone. The European Union has emerged, a political and economic bloc of 450 million people, with a combined GDP rivaling America as European countries are wealthy, stable, and democratic. So has Europe escaped American ownership? Not really. The structures created in 1948 still shape the transatlantic relationship. American troops still garrison Europe. American companies still dominate key sectors. American foreign policy still constrains European choices. The purchase, it turns out, was more permanent than anyone expected. In 1949, American soldiers deployed to Europe to protect it from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 33 years ago. The American troops are still there. Over 100,000 U.S. military personnel remain stationed in Europe. Germany alone hosts 35,000 American soldiers. Italy has 12,000. The UK has 9,000. Bases dot the continent from Spain to Poland, from Norway to Greece. Why? The original justification, containing the Soviet threat, is gone. Russia is a shadow of Soviet power. It couldn't conquer Western Europe even if it wanted to. But the troops remain because they serve other purposes. They project American power. They reassure allies. They give America leverage in European decisions. They remind everyone who the senior partner is. European leaders occasionally grumble about American bases. But they never seriously ask the Americans to leave. The bases bring jobs. They provide security. And asking America to leave would mean taking full responsibility for European defense. That's something Europe has never been willing to do. NATO requires member countries to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Most European countries don't meet this target. Germany, the richest country in Europe, spent only 5% for decades. Why invest in expensive militaries when America provides protection? This is the dependency trap. American security guarantees have allowed Europe to underinvest in defense. That underinvestment has made Europe more dependent on American security guarantees. The cycle reinforces itself. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Europe discovered just how dependent it had become. European armies were small and poorly equipped. European ammunition stockpiles were depleted. European defense industries couldn't ramp up production. After 75 years under the American umbrella, Europe had lost the ability to defend itself. America had to lead the response. American weapons poured into Ukraine. American intelligence guided Ukrainian operations. American diplomacy coordinated Western sanctions. Europe followed, Europe contributed, but Europe didn't lead. Europe couldn't lead. The capacity simply wasn't there. The Marshall Plan's architects would recognize this dynamic. They designed a system where Europe would be protected but dependent. That system still operates exactly as intended. American economic influence in Europe is less visible than military influence, but just as pervasive. American companies dominate the digital economy. Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta. These companies shape how Europeans communicate, shop, work, and think. European tech companies exist, but they're minor players compared to American giants. American finance dominates global markets. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. European banks hold dollar reserves. European companies borrow in dollars. European trade is priced in dollars. When America imposes financial sanctions, Europe complies, even when it hurts European interests. European companies abandoned business in Iran because American sanctions made dollar transactions illegal. European banks pay billions in fines to American regulators. This isn't occupation. It's integration so deep that separation has become unthinkable. European economies are wired into American systems at every level. Unplugging would cause chaos. The Marshall Plan created this integration deliberately. 75 years of deepening ties have made it irreversible. There have been moments when Europe tried to assert independence. Each time, it discovered the limits of its freedom. Suez, 1956. Britain and France invaded Egypt without American approval. America threatened their currencies. They withdrew within days. Vietnam, 1960s. France criticized American intervention in Southeast Asia. Charles de Gaulle pulled France from NATO's military command. America was annoyed, but didn't need French troops in Vietnam anyway. France remained in NATO's political structures. Iraq, 2003. France and Germany refused to support the American invasion of Iraq. American officials mocked old Europe. French fries were renamed freedom fries in congressional cafeterias. But ultimately, nothing happened. America invaded without them. Russia sanctions, 2022. Europe imposed devastating sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine invasion, sanctions that hurt European economies more than American ones. European consumers paid higher energy prices. It's been 75 years since the Marshall Plan began. Europe has changed enormously. The rubble is long gone. The European Union has emerged, a political and economic bloc of 450 million people, with a combined GDP rivaling America as European countries are wealthy, stable, and democratic. So has Europe escaped American ownership? Not really. The structures created in 1948 still shape the transatlantic relationship. American troops still garrison Europe. American companies still dominate key sectors. American foreign policy still constrains European choices. The purchase, it turns out, was more permanent than anyone expected. In 1949, American soldiers deployed to Europe to protect it from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 33 years ago. The American troops are still there. Over 100,000 U.S. military personnel remain stationed in Europe. Germany alone hosts 35,000 American soldiers. Italy has 12,000. The UK has 9,000. Bases dot the continent from Spain to Poland, from Norway to Greece. Why? The original justification, containing the Soviet threat, is gone. Russia is a shadow of Soviet power. It couldn't conquer Western Europe even if it wanted to. But the troops remain because they serve other purposes. They project American power. They reassure allies. They give America leverage in European decisions. They remind everyone who the senior partner is. European leaders occasionally grumble about American bases. But they never seriously ask the Americans to leave. The bases bring jobs. They provide security. And asking America to leave would mean taking full responsibility for European defense. That's something Europe has never been willing to do. NATO requires member countries to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Most European countries don't meet this target. Germany, the richest country in Europe, spent only 5% for decades. Why invest in expensive militaries when America provides protection? This is the dependency trap. American security guarantees have allowed Europe to underinvest in defense. That underinvestment has made Europe more dependent on American security guarantees. The cycle reinforces itself. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Europe discovered just how dependent it had become. European armies were small and poorly equipped. European ammunition stockpiles were depleted. European defense industries couldn't ramp up production. After 75 years under the American umbrella, Europe had lost the ability to defend itself. America had to lead the response. American weapons poured into Ukraine. American intelligence guided Ukrainian operations. American diplomacy coordinated Western sanctions. Europe followed, Europe contributed, but Europe didn't lead. Europe couldn't lead. The capacity simply wasn't there. The Marshall Plan's architects would recognize this dynamic. They designed a system where Europe would be protected but dependent. That system still operates exactly as intended. American economic influence in Europe is less visible than military influence, but just as pervasive. American companies dominate the digital economy. Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta. These companies shape how Europeans communicate, shop, work, and think. European tech companies exist, but they're minor players compared to American giants. American finance dominates global markets. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. European banks hold dollar reserves. European companies borrow in dollars. European trade is priced in dollars. When America imposes financial sanctions, Europe complies, even when it hurts European interests. European companies abandoned business in Iran because American sanctions made dollar transactions illegal. European banks pay billions in fines to American regulators. This isn't occupation. It's integration so deep that separation has become unthinkable. European economies are wired into American systems at every level. Unplugging would cause chaos. The Marshall Plan created this integration deliberately. 75 years of deepening ties have made it irreversible. There have been moments when Europe tried to assert independence. Each time, it discovered the limits of its freedom. Suez, 1956. Britain and France invaded Egypt without American approval. America threatened their currencies. They withdrew within days. Vietnam, 1960s. France criticized American intervention in Southeast Asia. Charles de Gaulle pulled France from NATO's military command. America was annoyed, but didn't need French troops in Vietnam anyway. France remained in NATO's political structures. Iraq, 2003. France and Germany refused to support the American invasion of Iraq. American officials mocked old Europe. French fries were renamed freedom fries in congressional cafeterias. But ultimately, nothing happened. America invaded without them. Russia sanctions, 2022. Europe imposed devastating sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine invasion, sanctions that hurt European economies more than American ones. European consumers paid higher energy prices. European companies lost the Russian market, but Europe stayed aligned with Washington. The pattern is consistent. Europe can disagree with America on secondary issues, but on matters America cares about deeply, Europe falls in line. The costs of defiance are too high. The European Union is, in one sense, the Marshall Plan's greatest success. American planners wanted European integration, they got it. The OEEC evolved into the OECD. The European coal and steel community became the common market, which became the European Union. European countries that had fought each other for centuries now share a currency, a parliament, and open borders. War between France and Germany is now unthinkable. That's an achievement worth celebrating. But the EU has never become a counterweight to American power. It was designed as a partner, not a rival. It was built under American sponsorship, according to American ideas, serving American interests. EU foreign policy is weak and divided. EU military capacity is minimal. EU tech companies can't compete with American giants. The EU regulates American companies, but depends on them completely. When Brexit happened, when Britain left the EU, the first thing Britain did was seek closer ties with America. The special relationship remained more important than European solidarity. The EU is real. European integration is real. But neither has produced genuine independence from American power. In 2025, the transatlantic relationship faces new pressures. American politics has become more skeptical of foreign commitments. Politicians question why American taxpayers should defend wealthy Europeans who won't defend themselves. NATO's future seems less certain than at any point since 1949. European leaders talk about strategic autonomy, the ability to act independently of America. They discuss European defense initiatives, European tech champions, European foreign policy. But talk is easier than action. Building European defense capacity would take decades and cost hundreds of billions. Challenging American tech dominance would require breaking up companies that European consumers love. Pursuing independent foreign policy would mean risking American displeasure. So far, Europe has chosen comfort over independence. 75 years of American protection have created habits that are hard to break. Every few years, American presidents remind Europe that protection isn't free. Donald Trump was blunter than most. He publicly criticized NATO allies for insufficient defense spending. He questioned whether America would actually defend countries that didn't pay their share. He threatened to withdraw. European leaders were alarmed. They increased defense budgets, slightly. They made promises, mostly unfulfilled. They hoped the pressure would pass. It didn't pass. The questions Trump raised persist. Why should America defend Europe forever? What does America get in return? Is the bargain still worth it? These are fair questions. The Marshall Plan was an investment, and investors expect returns. If Europe wants American protection, Europe should provide something of value. The uncomfortable truth is that Europe has been getting a good deal. American security on the cheap. American markets open to European goods. American technology available for European use. All for the price of following American leadership. If that deal changes, if America demands more or offers less, Europe will have to make difficult choices it has avoided for 3 generations. So what did America actually accomplish? The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. That's undeniable. Without American aid, recovery would have taken longer, cost more lives, and possibly failed altogether. The Soviet Union might have expanded westward. Communism might have taken root. But the Marshall Plan also created a dependency that persists today. Europe recovered under American supervision and never fully graduated to independence. The patient survived, but never left the hospital. Is that good or bad? From America's perspective, it's been excellent. $13 billion bought 75 years of loyal allies, open markets, military bases, and global influence. No investment in history has generated better returns. From Europe's perspective, it's more complicated. Peace and prosperity are valuable, but so is independence. Europe has the former in abundance. It has less of the latter than it might like. Let's be honest about what happened. America saved Europe. Genuinely, generously, at significant cost to American taxpayers. The Marshall Plan was a noble act that prevented suffering and preserved democracy. America also bought Europe, deliberately, strategically, with clear understanding of what they were purchasing. The Marshall Plan was an investment that generated enormous returns. Both statements are true. They don't contradict each other. This is how power works in the real world. Great powers don't do things purely from generosity. They don't do things purely from selfishness either. They do things that serve multiple purposes, moral and practical, generous and self-interested. The Marshall Plan was one of history's great achievements. It was also one of history's great purchases. Recognizing both doesn't diminish either. In 1947, Europe was starving. America sent food. In 1948, Europe was broke. America sent money. In 1949, Europe was defenseless. America sent soldiers. 75 years later, Europe is prosperous, peaceful, and still dependent on America. The Marshall Plan is remembered as the most generous act in history. And it was generous, genuinely, meaningfully generous. It saved millions of lives and rebuilt a continent. But it was also a purchase. America bought European markets for American companies. America bought European bases for American soldiers. America bought European alignment for American foreign policy. America bought a system that still operates today. $13 billion. That's what it cost to buy a continent. It was the best deal anyone ever made.